January 1943. Less than 10 days into his first patrol aboard USS Wahoo, an American submarine skipper performs reconnaissance of a Japanese base in the South Pacific. 9 miles into the occupied harbor, he spots the most dangerous possible threat. An enemy destroyer, armed with underwater bombs called depth charges, designed to sink submarines. Before the war, the decision would have been easy: stay safe. But to defeat Japan, they'll need a new generation of commander to take the offensive and pursue every contact against each enemy ship, putting his vessel and crew in the line of fire. In World War II, a subsea weapon allows warriors to fight from beneath the waves with cunning, force, and tenacity. Their enemies strike back. Revolutionary, but still sometimes primitive. It's a desperate bid to change the course of war. Their stories are legend. (1 p.m., January 24th, 1943. As the new commander of USS Wahoo, Dudley Morton discovers a Japanese destroyer in Wewak Harbor. The safe choice is to remain concealed and retreat unnoticed. If they're spotted, the waters here are too shallow to avoid a sustained depth charge attack. But Morton is determined to inflict serious damage on the enemy's fleet. The destroyer will not be spared. He positions his submarine 3,000 yards from the destroyer and prepares for attack. His strategy is to fire 3 torpedoes, betting at least one will hit.
TDC, give me a 1-degree spread on each of those fish. We're gonna fire tubes 2, 3, and 4. Fire 2. Fire 3. 3 firing. Fire 4. 4 fired electrically.
But the destroyer clips along faster than expected. All 3 torpedoes run through its wake. Morton increases the input speed for the destroyer. Wahoo fires again. But this torpedo also misses. The destroyer has changed course. The failure to land these shots allows the enemy to zero in on Wahoo. The destroyer charges, betting it can ram the sub in the shallow waters. Morton's aggression exposes a radical shift in the risk tolerance of American submarine captains. This scenario would have been unimaginable aboard Wahoo under its first commander. It was commissioned and brought into service just 5 months after the attack on Pearl Harbor. With so many battleships, escorts, and aircraft damaged or destroyed, submarines are charged with taking the fight to Japan to target Japanese merchant shipping.
This is going to be a war of attrition. It's going to be fought every convoy, every ship at a time.
Wahoo bears the name of a fish, a tradition forged in the earliest days of American submarines. It's a Gato-class sub, 312 feet long and 27 feet across the beam. Its combination of speed, endurance, and payload are almost unrivaled.
The Gato is probably the biggest mass production submarine of World War II by a long shot. It's about twice the size of what the Germans did. It's big for a reason. It's big because it's designed to operate very far from home for a long time.
There's sufficient food and supplies on board for the crew to remain at sea for 75 days. And enough diesel to cruise nearly halfway around the world without refueling.
And because it was a big sub, you could put in things that were extra. Size paid off big.
August 23rd, 1942. Wahoo embarked on its first patrol to sink Japanese ships and disrupt supply lines. Unfortunately, its leadership did not live up to the boat's promise. The skipper was Marvin Kennedy. His crew described him as gentlemanly. The U.S. Navy spent peacetime years training its submarine force as scouts to collect intelligence and avoiding contact with the enemy. When America entered the war, this risk aversion failed to deliver successful strikes.
They had too many skippers that just were too timid. They wanted to stay far away from their prey. They didn't want to raise the periscopes really high for fear of being seen. They didn't want to run on the surface for fear that a Japanese patrol plane might see it.
On October 5th, 1942, Kennedy failed to pursue a Japanese aircraft carrier. The crew watched as one of the most prestigious targets of the war sailed from their grasp.
They've put a lot at risk, long distance traveled, they're putting themselves in harm's way, and then to not attack aggressively and get the sinking is demoralizing. It has to hurt their morale, and Kennedy has to see it as well.
The second patrol wasn't much better. Under Kennedy's command, they returned to port with most of their torpedoes unused. In December, Wahoo's first skipper is relieved of submarine command. The U.S. Navy replaces over 40 skippers, nearly 1 in 3 by year's end.
America had built this perfect fighting machine in the Gato-class submarine, but didn't have the talent early in the war to be able to maximize that submarine for its full potential.
Wahoo's new skipper is Dudley "Mush" Morton.
Mush Morton takes command of the Wahoo at the start of its third patrol, in a really pivotal time in the submarine war. He's a Kentucky Baptist. He has broad shoulders and big hands, and a jaw that Time magazine describes as looking like a boulder. And he's kind of this James Dean-like figure of submarine service, you know.
Morton watched Kennedy fumble Wahoo's second patrol before taking command. He promises his men this time will be different.
Morton recognizes that a lot of submarine skippers aren't as aggressive as they need to be in order to truly fight the Japanese. He sees a lot of weaknesses in the strategy that others are employing.
Then,
Morton's first mission has 2 objectives. Reconnoiter a Japanese supply base called Wewak Harbor. Then, enter the patrol area around the island of Palau to hunt and sink Japanese shipping. Wahoo leaves the submarine base in Brisbane, Australia, January 16th, 1943. But just finding Wewak proves a challenge.
The Pacific Ocean is vast. The area sort of encompassing much of where the American submariners would patrol would be about 8 million square miles.
The coordinates are vague. Their target lies somewhere between 4 degrees south and 144 degrees east. A grid of nearly 4,700 square miles. Without accurate charts, direction comes from an unlikely source. A crew member purchased a school atlas for his kids while in Australia. One of its maps narrows the search for Wewak. They use it to produce a hand-drawn version as a navigational chart. With headings laid in, the crew proceeds on the surface towards Wewak, even during the daytime. This way, the sub can travel at over 20 knots or 23 miles per hour. Submerged, it can only push 9 knots for short bursts. It's faster, but makes the sub much easier to detect. Morton mitigates the risk with extra lookouts. After spotting an enemy aircraft, the crew moves to clear the bridge. Since they are unsure whether the plane has discovered them, Morton insists they wait until it is within 6 miles of the sub. He weighs the risk of possible aerial bombs against more surface running time. As the plane gets closer, the crew watches and waits, wondering if this new skipper might be pushing his luck too far. It's a risky game. Planes armed with bombs are a submarine's deadliest threat. Tense minutes pass. Just before it crosses into Morton's safety perimeter, the plane turns away without detecting Wahoo. Morton saves time averting the crash dive and keeps the crew's eyes peeled for targets, asserting their mission to sink ships. At 3 a.m. on January 24th, 1943, Wahoo reaches the mouth of Wewak Harbor. Perched on the edge of a fiercely protected shipping route in the Bismarck Sea, it shelters a Japanese supply base on the north coast of occupied New Guinea.
Bases at Wewak Harbor are positioned in such a way so that the Imperial Japanese forces can very quickly mobilize and strike out and knock off some of the supply lines to Australia.
Morton makes the decision to prowl the shallow bay.
For the submarine to enter the harbor, what they're doing is entering an area where there's not a lot of room to maneuver. Wewak Harbor will be defended. There's obviously infantry, there's guns, and the potential for warships. So to enter the harbor is very risky. But it's the only way to get a good reconnaissance.
9 miles in, Wahoo discovers a Japanese destroyer.
Normally, you're told not to go after destroyers because you should concentrate on the merchant ships. A lot of the question with submarines is how you decide what's worth the effort. Which ships are worth attacking and taking a chance with your life?
It's not just the target, but the location.
He's better off sneaking back out of the harbor and then making an attack as the ship leaves, because that way his ship is safe, and the crew, by extension, are safe.
But Morton decides to take on the tempting target.
The Japanese couldn't produce destroyers very fast. The fleet destroyers were not only hard to reproduce, but they had elite crews.
Every ship that the Americans sank in the Japanese, not only did they lose the ship, they lost their experienced sailors. They lost the money that it took to build that ship and the resources involved. You would erode their powerful war machine.
Before he strikes, Wahoo's captain gambles on a surprising substitution. He hands control of the periscope to his second-in-command.
Lieutenant Commander Dudley Morton is revolutionary in the way he conducts attacks from his submarine. He uses his executive officer on the periscope as the co-approach officer, and he sets up the attack in his head without being a slave to one particular area, in this case the periscope, which is traditional for submarine captains.
It's really easy if you're looking through the periscope to get hung up on exactly what you see in that narrow frame of field. Morton believes it's much better for him to be able to sort of step back, have that 30,000-foot view of the whole battlefield, because it's constantly evolving, it's constantly changing, and he needs to be able to be focused on the big picture.
The job goes to Richard Hetherington O'Kane.
You only get a few shots of looking through a periscope. What you do is you make a guess as to where the target is and how fast it's going and what direction. Takes a quick look around with a periscope. It'll be supplemented by other things, but it's really all on his shoulders.
Distance 2,200 yards and decreasing.
O'Kane calls the destroyer's range. Morton plots the attack.
Fire 3.
3 firing.
As he fires 3 torpedoes, it costs Morton an eighth of Wahoo's ordnance, but increases the odds he'll sink the target before it sinks him. When the first 3 torpedoes miss, Morton increases the destroyer's speed in his calculation to 20 knots and fires. They miss again. Wahoo has expended its ammunition to no avail. Worse, they have drawn the attention of the sub-destroyer.
You're a submarine officer. As long as you're submerged, not bothering anybody, you're invisible and you're safe. Every time you fire a torpedo, if it's visible, that gives the other side an incentive to get you.
But Morton does not attempt to dive into darkness. He leaves the periscope up, announcing Wahoo's exact position. He has just 2 more torpedoes loaded in the forward tubes. The destroyer charges. Ramming a submarine to damage its hull is a crude but effective tactic. For Wahoo, the close proximity leaves no time to evade if its torpedoes miss. The only option left is an extremely risky shot. Sailors call it down the throat. Morton aims a shot straight at the ship's narrow bow.
He has no other option. If he doesn't, the destroyer has all the speed and maneuverability to pound him into the silt, and there's nothing he can do about it. So he's forcing him to attack and trying to change the attack into a situation where he can have the advantage.
As the destroyer closes in, Morton's timing has to be perfect. If they fire from more than 1,200 yards, the destroyer has time to evade. But within 700 yards, the torpedo won't have time to arm and detonate.
I fired 2.
They release 2 torpedoes. Less than a minute after the previous shot flies wide, the second torpedo to fire, down the throat, lands a direct hit. The blow cripples the destroyer's hull.
We got a hit.
Wahoo plunges deep under the damaged ship to avoid a collision and escape the carnage. The warship remains afloat on the surface.
After an attack, sometimes the ship goes down right away. Other times it can take hours. Sometimes you can torpedo a ship and it doesn't sink.
The wounded ship starts to drop its cache of depth charges. More than 80 feet down, Wahoo's crew must prepare for the worst.
A depth charge attack can be a truly terrifying thing for these submarine sailors because you're in a windowless boat, so you can't see where the danger is coming from. You're just trapped in this tin can with explosions that are shaking your boat.
There's a lot of noise. They go off. You hear them go off. It's nerve-wracking.
Suddenly, the explosions cease. A violent cracking noise penetrates Wahoo's hull.
They're not that far from the boat to begin with. So you can hear this right through the hull, the sound of the water rushing, the sound of the boilers exploding, and certainly the sound of steam and water boiling.
The crew recognizes the sound of the doomed destroyer's boilers hitting cold seawater. The destroyer has split open. Wahoo ascends to periscope depth to confirm the kill. It burns as its bow tilts into the sea. Morton banks his first win as a submarine commander. He now needs to steer clear of enemy countermeasures to escape the bay.
Down scope.
He drops Wahoo down to 100 feet and slips away. As darkness falls, the Japanese light fires on Wewak shores, perhaps to reveal a glimpse of the sub sailing by. Wahoo cruises deep, past the flames. Mush Morton clearly demonstrates to his crew the potential of the Gato-class engineering. And despite the victory, he's not ready for home. They have 18 torpedoes left to sink Japanese ships. Morton and his new crew are just getting started. The next leg of his patrol takes Wahoo north, towards an island chain also occupied by the Japanese. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, Japan continued its sweep across Asia. The conquest created a realm triple the size by the middle of 1942.
The Japanese message that they send the world is Asia for the Asians, but it really means Asia for the Japanese. They've been fighting a war in China since 1931, really, and very intensively since 1937. Once it looked as though the Japanese were going to try to conquer all of southern Asia, we wanted to stop them.
As an island nation, Japan relies on spoils from freshly annexed lands to fuel its smelters and feed its men. Shipping routes crisscross the Pacific.
The Japanese materially bankrupt for all their supplies. They had to bring in everything almost from other places. Not only food to feed its burgeoning population, but also all of its war materials. The bauxite needed to make aluminum, rubber for tires, cotton for uniforms, and more importantly, oil, which is the most vital thing to be able to power their battleships, fighter planes, and bombers. It really depended on a maritime highway system. If the Japanese economy is cut off, you can cut off its ability to buy and bring in the imports it needs, to build the war goods that it needs, and to fuel its war machine.
In 1943, Chester William Nimitz commands the American Pacific Fleet. His forces practice unrestricted submarine warfare in the Pacific.
Unrestricted submarine warfare means if I see it, I sink it. Once everything is fair game, that's total war.
Under Nimitz, submarines are assigned to specific patrols to attack the Japanese. Wahoo heads for an island pass, used to fast-track goods from Palau to Japan. Palau exports key natural resources.
There's bauxite, which is used for aluminum, which becomes the airframes for the Japanese aircraft. And secondly, of course, phosphate for fertilizer. You can fertilize your crops and get better food production.
But operating in these waters won't be easy. To help tip the balance, Wahoo needs to locate enemy ships. More than 30 hours into the search, the crew spots smoke on the horizon.
Captain, you might want to see this.
Wahoo has found not one ship, but three. A Japanese convoy. 2 freighters carry goods. The third is a troop transport. Morton knows that Allied convoys were perfect targets for Nazi Germany earlier in the war.
The Germans combined numbers of U-boats. The wolf packs were a way of finding convoys and then concentrating against them.
In the Pacific, Morton faces these 3 ships alone.
You're by yourself, deep in enemy waters. You have to be very self-reliant. Every time you do anything, you're exposing yourself to destruction.
Wahoo's new skipper must decide how to strike an entire convoy.
Close on target.
In January 1943, an American submarine has not successfully attacked a Japanese convoy. The choice will make Morton and Wahoo famous and infamous. In January 1943, USS Wahoo stalks a Japanese convoy near Palau in the South Pacific. The assault will expose Dudley Morton's submarine much longer within enemy waters than attacking one ship.
Submarines are uniquely vulnerable to attacks from depth charges, aerial bombs, even gunfire.
The more aggressive you are, the more chances you give the enemy to get you.
Wahoo sets out in pursuit. Once in position, they target the lead freighter. In Morton's time, American skippers will expend on average nearly 12 torpedoes per ship sunk. Wahoo has 18 warheads against ships loaded with enemy troops and supplies. He will need to be more efficient if he wants to sink them all.
I'm firing a torpedo at a ship. He's moving, I'm moving. The angles are all tricky. You have to figure out where he's moving and how fast.
The torpedo data computer is the submariner's mathematician.
The torpedo data computer is a way of figuring out where the target is, how fast it's going, what direction it's going, then working out what the torpedo has to do to get to it.
Readings from the periscope tell the data computer, or TDC, the enemy's range, bearing, and angle relative to the submarine's bow. It tracks the target and sets a precise course for the torpedo. During the Second World War, the American Navy relies heavily on the TDC.
You got it, it aims, fire the torpedo, does the rest. No one else had quite that integrated system.
The first two torpedoes race towards a Dakar Maru, a Japanese freighter with a 56-foot beam. Morton quickly turns on her sister ship, a 475-foot-long Arizona Maru.
Stand by 4.
4 on standby.
Fire 4.
The Mark 14 steam torpedo leaves a wake, a very visible wake in the water. So as the torpedo is fired, you're literally identifying your location with a line from where the torpedo is to where you were. The longer you take the fire, the greater your chance of being caught.
The first two torpedoes hit their mark. The Dakar Maru starts to list, but only one of two torpedoes meant for the second freighter strikes and just slows the Arizona Maru down. With two ships wounded, Wahoo's skipper shifts his focus to the third,
Stand by 3.
a Siwa Maru transport, the convoy's prize.
If it's carrying people, you are literally eliminating the threat of a brigade or a division, which would, in the end, the Marines would have to storm the beach to defeat.
Morton decides to fire 3 torpedoes into the transport ship.
Fire 3.
It draws down Wahoo's supply of ordnance, but it increases his chance at a kill. Morton doesn't want to let it get away. He knows the ship is probably loaded with troops key to Japan's war effort, on their way to fight Americans. 2 of the 3 warheads hit. The transport is crippled. But the second freighter returns to the fight and charges straight at Wahoo. It's a tactic called ramming.
If you can ram the submarine, your chance of escape obviously is very, very high. If you try to run away, the submarine will always catch you. So by charging it, what they're trying to do is eliminate the threat the only way they can.
For the second time in 3 days, Morton's submarine faces a charging ship. For the second time, they don't back down.
Up until this point, submarine skippers would go out and they would shoot at a ship and hopefully sink it, and then they would often retreat. And rather than go in and just fire and then flee, he came back time and again.
Wahoo fires 2 more torpedoes at the charging freighter. The freighter keeps coming. Morton abandons the collision course and dives his sub.
Stern plane's 2 degrees.
Now the Wahoo, the hunter, is now being hunted. But the Wahoo has most of the advantages here. If the Wahoo can dive, the transport will evade them and they can follow the transport. If the transport gets hit by the torpedoes, same result, you still sink the transport. The Wahoo still has the advantage, despite the fact that it's being attacked.
Morton has spent 4 precious torpedoes on the Arizona Maru, but has failed to sink it. He allows the freighter to limp off and turns back to the troop-filled Siwa Maru.
Fire 4.
2 more torpedoes seal the ship's fate.
The explosion registers high enough it obscures the bridge, so you're talking about 70 feet in the air. The crew, of course, is now trying to abandon ship. Huge explosion, which could mean the Maru was carrying explosives. It could mean it was carrying something of high volatility, aviation fuel maybe, and that's what was struck.
They have now sunk 2/3 of the convoy, but Morton still wants the freighter that got away. The Maru has now been joined by a tanker. But the cost of attacking 3 targets from underwater scuttles the plan. While Wahoo is submerged, it runs off of 250 lead-acid battery cells, each 4 feet high.
They could stay underwater on battery power for up to 48 hours, but only if they're going at 2 knots, which, that's only about 3 miles an hour. I mean, that's the pace most people would just go walk.
After hours of running and gunning, Wahoo's batteries are drained. Morton must call off the chase, and he's forced to surface. 2 engines are sacrificed to recharging. With limited speed and range, he decides to circle back and check on the target he hit earlier.
The transport sinks slowly enough that those on board get into the boats.
20 Japanese lifeboats dot the Bismarck Sea. Hundreds of men are in and around them, victims of Morton's torpedoes, but also declared enemies who Morton believes are committed to destroying Americans.
He thinks they're troops, they're going to go ashore, they'll still be effective ashore, they'll be killing us when they get there. Better to kill them now. He thinks of the boats as legitimate targets. And if they're legitimate targets, of course you shoot them up.
As Morton considers the situation, he orders his crew to be at the ready.
Fire!
But Morton is wrong about these troops.
He orders his gunners to go ahead and open fire. He doesn't know it, but a lot of these people in the water are actually Indian POWs that the Japanese have actually picked up. And he assumes that they're all just Japanese soldiers, troops that may be being transported. And they go on and they end up shooting and killing 195 of these Indian POWs, in addition to about 87 Japanese troops. Morton was never reprimanded for this act. In fact, he was awarded the Army Distinguished Service Cross by General MacArthur for sinking these ships.
We tended not to think that you should shoot up survivors. However, it was also an extremely savage war in which Japanese survivors often kept fighting. So that also feeds into what happens.
Mush Morton's killing of these POWs, it's really a dark cloud that even today still hangs over the legacy of the Wahoo.
By 2 p.m., Wahoo's skipper moves on. The submarine's batteries are charged. Wahoo can now pursue the ships that escaped. The freighter and a tanker have a head start of at least 2 hours. To catch up, Morton must remain surfaced. This makes Wahoo vulnerable. The Japanese have almost certainly deployed anti-submarine units to protect what's left of their convoy.
You don't want to run a surface fight with someone because it doesn't take that much to put you out of business. That's an awfully dangerous thing to do.
Just after 3:30 p.m., a puff of smoke, then the profile of two ships off the port bow. A tanker carrying millions of gallons of oil flanks the fleeing Arizona Maru. But Wahoo has only 7 torpedoes left. Morton plans to spend 3 on the tanker. A hit will deny precious fuel to Japan's war machines, but leaves limited options in case of counterattack.
As soon as the torpedo counts down to just a handful or a couple of torpedoes, Morton's ability to attack is seriously diminished.
As darkness falls, Wahoo readies for a final offensive.
Fire 2. Fire 3. Fire 4.
3 torpedoes race towards the Manzia Maru tanker. Just one hits, and the ship still sails. It costs 2 more to halt the tanker. Morton has 2 torpedoes left to sink the freighter he's chased for hours. Before he can fire, the Maru launches its own attack. Munitions light up the night sky. Shells drop into the water, and some ricochet over the periscope.
The submarine sacrifices armor plate for stealth. So if that hull is punctured in any way, shape, or form and can't be repaired, that submarine can never dive, which means its greatest chance of survival in enemy-controlled waters just vanishes. So to be on the surface and under direct fire from a ship, whether destroyer or transport, is extremely scary. And for the crew, extremely dangerous.
Fire 3.
January 1943, off the coast of Palau in the South Pacific. A submarine commander has downed a Japanese freighter and a troop ship. An Arizona-class freighter from the convoy now attacks the American crew.
Scope down.
Wahoo dives 90 feet to escape the gunfire. The splash of shells continues to echo through the hull. Even though merchant shipping is not usually armed with depth charges, out of periscope range, the submarine is helpless and can't fight back. About 15 minutes later, Morton creeps back to the surface. The freighter has stopped firing. But a cold light sweeps over the horizon. A submarine-killing destroyer is now on the hunt for Wahoo. Morton doesn't have the firepower to take it on.
There's not much you can do about a destroyer. They're often as fast or faster than you are. So it puts the submarine at a major disadvantage.
But Wahoo's skipper makes the decision to finish what he started. As the destroyer closes in, Morton fires his last 2 torpedoes at the final ship of the original Japanese convoy.
Got a hit.
The freighter slips from the light. As the destroyer deals with the carnage, Wahoo retreats to the safety of the open sea. Commander Mush Morton gets his kill. On February 7th, 1943, Wahoo steams proudly into Pearl Harbor. A broom lashed to its periscope. It's a sly wink to the naval tradition of claiming a clean sweep. The Navy and the press love it. The brass holds up Morton and his crew as the first U.S. submarine to sink a convoy. More than 11,000 tons of Japanese ships and shipping. Despite submariners being notorious for their silent service, Morton and Wahoo make the papers. He even consults on Cary Grant's wartime thriller, Destination Tokyo. Morton's aggressive tactics changed the conduct of the American submarine campaign.
That was the first time in the war when any submarine skipper had actually done something like that. No one had really dared to think that, hey, could an American submarine go in and destroy every ship? Well, Mush Morton showed that it was a possibility. It set a higher bar for submarine skippers going out after that. It wasn't just Mush Morton, it was the support team he had, primarily with Dick O'Kane. As a leader, his men really loved him.
Wahoo's triumph would be short-lived. Before year's end, Wahoo is struck by a hail of enemy bombs in the Sea of Japan. It would be declared overdue and presumed lost. At 36 years old, skipper Mush Morton goes down with his ship. But his impact on submarine warfare is critical for the U.S. Navy.
Mush Morton was the trailblazer. If you look at the totality of the war, he's sort of the center fulcrum on which all the strategy and tactics really change. It's fascinating because all of that really falls on the shoulders of one individual.
Morton and the crew of Wahoo demonstrate the tenacity and tactics needed to tip the balance of power in the Pacific.
We showed the rest of these skippers what could be done, what they could accomplish with this amazing submarine that the American Navy had constructed.